In the frozen wastelands of the Arctic, a long-abandoned Cold War facility holds a dark and deadly secret. When a military team is sent to investigate a failed experiment from 1962, they uncover chilling whispers of madness, violence, and something far more sinister lurking beneath the ice. As they venture deeper, the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and survival becomes uncertain. What truly lies buried in the glacier? Why was it hidden for so long? The Svalbard Bunker Experiment by Margot Holloway. It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. Part 1. The Svalbard Archipelago. In the bitter chill of January 1962, as Cold War tensions were firmly gripping the entire globe, a remote Scandinavian research facility, buried deep beneath the ice of Svalbard, stirred to life. Located over 1,000 kilometers from the northernmost coast of Norway, the Svalbard Archipelago had long been an isolated, icy wilderness, a distant outpost of human civilization, far removed from the eyes of the world. Nestled beneath one of its ancient glaciers, the facility was so remote that even the few scientific outposts scattered across the region were completely unaware of its existence. The sun had vanished from the sky in late November and wouldn't return until spring, leaving the land in unrelenting darkness. This was not a place meant for human life. In the heart of the Arctic winter, temperatures frequently plunged to a bone-chilling minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the wind howled through the desolate landscape, carrying the bitter sting of snow and ice. The air was so cold that any exposed skin would freeze within minutes, and the icy winds cut through even the thickest layers of protective gear. Outside the facility, the only sounds were the cracking of the glacier and the persistent, ever-present wind, which howled like a mournful ghost across the frozen wasteland. Snowstorms often engulfed the entire region, creating whiteouts that made it impossible to see even a few feet ahead. Beneath this glacier, concealed by ice that had been frozen for millennia, the COVERT research facility remained hidden. Its metal walls were thick and reinforced, yet even here the cold seeped in. Every surface within the bunker was frigid to the touch, and condensation formed on the walls only to freeze moments later, creating a seemingly ever-growing layer of frost. The facility was equipped with cutting-edge Cold War technology, but even this advanced equipment struggled to function in the uncompromising cold. Heating systems fought a constant losing battle, barely able to keep the interior livable. The air was heavy, uncomfortable, and every breath felt labored, as if the cold itself was weighing down on the very chests of all those within the base. The bunker, officially non-existent, was a secret collaboration between Sweden and Norway, hidden not only from their Cold War rivals, but also from their own people. To ensure secrecy, the site had been built far from any inhabited area, specifically chosen for its extreme isolation and inhospitable conditions. The nearest human settlement was Longyearbyen, the world's northernmost town, but even that lay over 150 kilometers away, unreachable in the winter without specialized equipment. For the 6 volunteers trapped within the facility, there could be no possibility of escape or rescue. The Arctic ice surrounded them on all sides, and the dark, unyielding winter kept them prisoners beneath the earth. No natural light penetrated the bunker. The only illumination came from the sterile, artificial glow of the facility's fluorescent lights, which flickered ominously as the cold strained the electrical systems. It was in this frozen purgatory that the experiment began. The beginning. Project Northern Watch was designed to push the boundaries of human endurance, to test how far isolation and deprivation could be stretched before the human mind began to break. The facility, though equipped with all the necessities, food, water, air filtration systems, was in essence a prison. There were no clocks, no sun, no way to measure the passing of time. Days blended seamlessly into nights, and the endless darkness weighed heavy on the minds of the volunteers, each of them trapped in this cold, desolate world. The 6 participants were warned and would quickly learn that the cold was not just an external force, but something that crept into their very bones. The isolation would gnaw at them, amplified by the brutal Arctic conditions. Outside, the glacier would groan and shift, its ancient ice slowly moving and cracking, filling the bunker with low, reverberating sounds that felt almost alive. These noises, combined with the darkness, would generate an inescapable sense of unease. Indeed, they'd also been warned in advance that it would feel as if the glacier itself was watching them, waiting. Project Northern Watch had been conceived in secret, a response to both Soviet and American advances in space exploration. Sweden and Norway, nations with small but ambitious space programs, feared being left behind. To give their astronauts the edge in the coming race to the stars, they needed to push the human body and mind further than ever before. The mission? To study the effects of prolonged isolation and sleep deprivation on the human psyche, under conditions designed to mimic the cold, sterile void of space. It was an experiment with one simple yet terrifying goal: push the limits of human endurance and see what emerged on the other side. As one might expect, the Arctic Circle provided the perfect setting for such an experiment. Its remoteness offered isolation so profound it bordered on madness, while the unyielding cold mirrored the desolation of space. The bunker itself was a claustrophobic maze of steel corridors, sterile and unwelcoming, buried beneath tons of ice. Inside, the temperature hovered just above freezing, maintained by a life support system designed to replicate the chilling conditions astronauts would face in the vacuum of space. 6 individuals had been chosen to participate in the experiment: 3 scientists, 2 soldiers, and 1 journalist. The volunteers were carefully selected for their resilience. Brilliant minds and hardened bodies prepared to endure the physical and psychological extremes of isolation. There was Dr. Alva Lindström, a Swedish neuroscientist specializing in sleep disorders; Captain Henrik Rask, a Norwegian military officer who had spent years in Arctic survival training; and Dr. Karin Ek, a biochemist with expertise in human metabolism. The soldiers, Erik Berg and Lars Nielsen, were elite Norwegian commandos trained to withstand extreme environments, while the lone journalist, Johan Jansen, had been sent under the guise of documenting the experiment for future generations, though in truth his role was to provide an outsider's perspective, untouched by military protocol or scientific detachment. Their task was a simple, yet brutal one. For 90 days they would live and work inside the bunker, cut off from natural light, time, and all contact with the outside world, save for a series of transmissions from their superiors. There would be no clocks, no way to measure the passing of days. The only food they would consume was synthetic, processed rations designed to sustain them but offering very little in the way of comfort or flavor. Their every move, however, would be monitored by a vast array of cameras and sensors, though no direct communication or rescue was planned unless the situation became catastrophic. At the heart of the experiment was a serum. Developed in secret, it was an experimental drug designed to eliminate the body's need for sleep. Theoretically, it would allow the volunteers to remain alert and functional for the full 90 days, enhancing cognitive performance and physical endurance beyond normal human capacity. Sleep, after all, was considered the greatest weakness in long-term space missions. If the body could be freed from its need for rest, the possibilities for deep space exploration were limitless. As such, the serum was their key to the future, but its effects were untested on humans. On their arrival, the volunteers were immediately introduced to the regimen. The bunker's sterile, softly lit chambers hummed with the low vibration of the machines designed to keep them alive. There was no warmth in this place, only cold steel, and the ever-present sensation of weight pressing down from the ice above. Upon arrival, they were immediately stripped of personal belongings, dressed in identical grey jumpsuits, and given their first doses of the serum. The participants had been chosen well. Each one of them swallowed it without hesitation, their eyes betraying only a flicker of curiosity and uncertainty. Week 1. The first week passed uneventfully. The volunteers quickly adapted to their routine, performing cognitive tasks, maintaining the equipment, and conversing in the sparse recreation room. The serums seemed to work as intended. None of them felt tired. In fact, they felt sharper, their thoughts clearer than ever before. Indeed, Dr. Lindstrom marveled at the effects on her own mind, already considering the potential for groundbreaking advancements in human biology. Captain Rask, however, maintained a watchful eye on his team, noting that morale remained high despite the claustrophobic conditions. Yet even in those early days, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible hints that something was off. There was a lingering coldness in the air that the heating system couldn't quite dispel. Then there was a faint echo in the corridors, like whispers carried by the wind, though no wind could penetrate the bunker's icy shell. But these were all dismissed, chalked up to the mind playing tricks in the absence of sleep. The experiment was progressing as planned. Or so they thought. As the days stretched into weeks, the serum did more than just suppress their need for sleep. It truly sharpened their senses to a degree they'd never experienced before, heightening awareness but also amplifying every sound, every flicker of shadow. The sterile halls of the bunker began to feel less like a laboratory and more like a prison. Conversations became tense, and small disagreements exploded, taking on the weight of existential crises. And still, above all, the whispers persisted. Week 3. By the third week, subtle cracks had begun to appear in the carefully crafted structure of Project Northern Watch. The volunteers, once eager and alert, now carried an unmistakable sense of unease, though none were willing to admit it out loud. At first glance, everything seemed to be progressing as planned. Their cognitive tests remained sharp, and physically they showed no signs of fatigue. The serum was working. But beneath the surface, something darker was stirring, and it started with the whispers. At the outset, they were easy to ignore. It was a faint sound, barely audible, like the distant hum of machinery buried deep within the glacier's core. The volunteers all wrote it off as the product of stress and the constant maddening silence of the bunker. Dr. Lindstrom, always the pragmatist, suggested that the brain was probably filling the void left by the absence of external stimuli. This was an auditory hallucination caused by prolonged isolation and the absence of sleep. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing down the steel corridors, slipping through the walls and seeping into their thoughts. Johan Janssen, the journalist, was the first to mention it out loud. "I hear them at night," he confessed one morning over breakfast, his eyes bloodshot despite the fact that none of them had slept in weeks. "Voices, like people talking in the next room. When I check, there's no one there." The others exchanged uneasy glances, although no one responded. They'd all heard the whispers. It was just easier to pretend they hadn't. As time wore on, the whispers took on a more sinister tone. What had once been a vague murmur now seemed almost like speech. There were fragments of words, half-formed sentences. In the dead of night, when the only sound should have been the soft hum of the ventilation system, some of the volunteers swore they could hear their names being called. Captain Rask dismissed the idea immediately, attributing it to frayed nerves. "We're isolated. Our minds are playing tricks on us," he assured them, though his tone noticeably lacked its usual authority. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something that defied logic. The behavioral shifts soon followed. It began with Lars Nielsen, one of the soldiers. A normally quiet and composed man, Lars had been a model of discipline for the first few weeks, maintaining order and routine despite the surreal nature of their surroundings. But now, his demeanor had slowly but surely begun to change. He became irritable, snapping at the others for the slightest infractions. His eyes, once calm and watchful, were now wild, darting around the room as if constantly searching for something just out of sight. One evening he confided in Dr. Lindstrom. "There's something in the shadows," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen it moving, watching us." Well, Dr. Lindstrom tried to reassure him, offering a clinical explanation. "It's a trick of the mind, Lars. The lack of sleep, the isolation, it's making you see things that aren't there." But Lars wasn't convinced. He began patrolling the corridors at night, armed with a makeshift weapon he'd fashioned from a piece of equipment. His footsteps echoed loudly in the otherwise silent bunker, a constant reminder to the others of his growing paranoia. And then came the first real incident, something none of them could dismiss. Lars burst into the common area one night, eyes wide with fear and anger. "You're all in on it," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at the others. "I've seen the way you look at me. You're conspiring against me, trying to drive me mad." The outburst was shocking, but not entirely unexpected. The atmosphere in the bunker had been steadily shifting from one of quiet camaraderie to one of overwhelming tension for some time. Every conversation felt charged, every glance weighted with suspicion. They were all on edge, and their minds were fraying at the seams. Captain Rask attempted to calm him, speaking in a measured tone. "No one is conspiring against you, Lars. We're all in this together. You need to get a hold of yourself." But Lars wouldn't listen. He retreated to his room, quickly locking himself inside. From that moment on, he refused to interact with the others, and was convinced they were plotting against him. His paranoia was unfortunately contagious, seeping into the minds of the remaining volunteers. Every whispered conversation was now suspect, every shared glance a potential betrayal. The once sterile environment of the bunker had now become claustrophobic, its narrow corridors feeling like they were closing in on them. Part 2. Day 30. It was on day 30 that communication from the outside world finally broke down. Up until that point, the transmissions from their superiors had been brief but regular. Coded messages checking on their progress, offering vague reassurances that everything was proceeding according to plan. But on the 30th day, the daily transmission arrived garbled, the static nearly drowning out the words. What little they could make out was disturbing. "Anomaly detected. Threat escalating. Terminate if necessary." The message was fragmented, and no matter how hard they tried to decode it, the full meaning remained elusive. But the tone was unmistakable. Something had gone wrong, and whatever it was dangerous. They sent a reply, requesting clarification, but there was no response. Hours passed, and the silence from the outside world stretched on, deepening their sense of isolation. They were alone, truly and completely. This realization sank in like a stone. "What do they mean by threat?" Dr. Eck asked, her voice trembling slightly, breaking the uneasy silence that had settled over them. No one had an answer, but the fear in the room was evident, thickening the already stifling air. Captain Rask attempted to regain control, ordering everyone to focus on their tasks, but it was clear that the breakdown in communication had shaken them all. Without the anchor of the incoming daily transmissions, their sense of time, indeed of reality itself, began to slip. The whispers grew louder at night, louder than they'd ever been before. Some of the volunteers swore they could hear them speaking directly into their ears, their breath cold against their skin, though the bunker's vents were far away. Lars Nielsen was the first to completely snap. Day 40. By day 40, the Arctic isolation protocol was unraveling at the seams. What had begun as a controlled scientific experiment to test the limits of human endurance was now teetering on the edge of disaster. The serum, once heralded as a breakthrough, had begun to backfire in ways no one could have anticipated. The initial clarity it provided had turned into a nightmare of relentless hyper-awareness, leaving the volunteers' minds raw and exposed to the horrors that lurked in the depths of their subconscious. Hallucinations, which had previously been mere whispers or fleeting shadows, now became impossible to dismiss. Dr. Lindstrom, the neuroscientist, was the first to report seeing the grotesque figures. She tried to explain it away as a symptom of overstimulation, but the rational part of her mind was losing ground. "They're just visual distortions," she told herself, though each time she saw them, the creatures seemed more real, more solid. They were humanoid, but wrong, twisted in unnatural ways, with 2 long limbs and faces contorted in expressions of frozen, sinister glee. At the corners of her vision, they would loom, retreating into the dark corners of the bunker as soon as she turned her head. Johan Janssen, the journalist, was no better off. He paced the halls in a constant state of agitation, mumbling to himself, his hands shaking as though he were perpetually cold. "They're coming for us," he muttered over and over. "They're here, watching, waiting." He refused to go into certain rooms, claiming that the figures lingered there longer, the grins widening with every passing day. The rest of the team tried to maintain a veneer of calm, but it was clear that the experiment was spiraling out of control. Everyone heard the murmurs now, voices that seemed to seep through the walls like the cold itself. Sometimes they whispered incomprehensible phrases. Other times they called out the volunteers' names in mocking, sing-song tones. The hallucinations fed off the isolation, growing more intense with every passing hour. There was no escape, no reprieve, and no way to rest. Their bodies no longer needed sleep, but their minds craved it, the relentless wakefulness warping their perceptions and sense of reality. Then, without warning, the temperature inside the bunker began to plummet. The life support systems were designed to maintain a steady, habitable climate, but now frost crept along the steel walls, thickening with each passing hour. Cold was biting, far beyond anything the equipment should have allowed. The volunteers bundled themselves in every scrap of clothing they had, but the chills seemed to sink into their bones, the freezing air more oppressive than ever before. "It's the glacier," Dr. Eck muttered one evening as the group huddled in the common area, their breath visible in the cold air. Her eyes had taken on a wild, almost fevered look. "It's the ice. There's something in the ice." The others stared at her, half expecting some scientific rationale, but none came. "It's ancient," she whispered, barely able to keep her thoughts in check. "Something buried beneath the glacier. It's been here long before us, long before this facility. We've disturbed it." Captain Rask tried to rein her in. "You're losing it, Eck. We all are. It's just the serum messing with our heads." But she was insistent, pacing the room with a manic energy. "No, you don't understand. It's not the serum. This place, it's not just a bunker. It's a tomb. We're not alone here." My words sent a shiver down the spine of every volunteer. The truth was, they all felt it. A growing presence in the bunker. Something far older than the experiment. Something that defied explanation. The lights flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The power systems, once reliable, were now erratic, failing for minutes at a time before sputtering back to life. It was as if the very fabric of the facility was decaying along with their sanity. It was around this time that Eric Berg, one of the soldiers, snapped. Always the quiet one, Eric had remained composed for as long as he could, but the pressure had finally broken him. Convinced that the others had been taken over by the grotesque figures they saw lurking in the shadows, he barricaded himself inside the storage room, dragging supplies and equipment to block the door. The others tried to reason with him, shouting through the thick metal door, but he refused to listen. His voice soon became hoarse from screaming accusations at them, raving about possession and betrayal. "They're not human anymore," he yelled through the door. "You can't trust them. I've seen it seen their eyes, the way they look at me when they think I'm not watching. They're changing. Dr. Lindstrom tried to coax him out, but there was no reasoning with him. He'd crossed a line and his mind had been shattered by the serum, the isolation and the fear. Days passed and Eric refused to emerge. The bunker's halls were eerily quiet without the constant sound of his pacing footsteps. No one dared speak of the growing sense that something was terribly wrong, not just with Eric, but with all of them. The cold deepened further, the frost growing thicker on the walls, and the whispers never ceased. When they finally broke down the door to the storage room, what they found inside was worse than they could have imagined. Eric Berg was dead. His body lay crumpled in the corner of the room, twisted in a grotesque pose. The temperature inside the bunker should have been cold, but not that cold. His skin was frozen solid, rimed with frost, as though he'd been left outside in the Arctic night. His face was contorted into a maniacal grin. His eyes were wide, staring, reflecting the madness that had consumed him in his final moments. Worse still were the marks on his body. Deep gashes, as if he'd been attacked, but there was no sign of a struggle. The door had been locked from the inside. The volunteers stood in horrified silence, the sight of Eric's mutilated corpse sending a fresh wave of terror through them. No one spoke, but the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Was it suicide, murder, or something else entirely? Captain Rusk was the first to speak, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fear. "We need to leave," he said, looking each of them in the eye. "This is no longer an experiment. We're not safe here." But even as he spoke, they all knew the truth. There was nowhere to go. The bunker was buried beneath tons of ice, miles away from civilization, and the exits had long been sealed shut. They were trapped, surrounded by the freezing dark, and someone was hunting them. The air grew colder still, and the whispers now seemed almost gleeful, echoing from the very walls of the bunker. The grotesque figures were no longer content to remain in the shadows. They were coming closer. The turning point. The bunker had become a tomb. Eric's frozen corpse had been a breaking point, the first undeniable proof that something far worse than isolation was plaguing them. After his death, all of the survivors struggled to hold on to the thin threads of sanity that remained. The cold deepened, frost creeping like tendrils across the steel walls, and the figures in the shadows no longer retreated. They watched, waited. The whispers echoed through the halls with gleeful malice, gnawing at the edges of their minds. Dr. Lindstrom, the neuroscientist, was the first to fully realize what was happening. Days, or had it been weeks, after Eric's death, she retreated into her quarters, frantically sifting through the data they collected since the experiment began. What she found sent her into a spiral of dread. No, it wasn't just the serum. The serum had been designed to eliminate the need for sleep, but had accidentally altered their brain chemistry, pushing their minds into a state of perpetual alertness. But that wasn't all. The combination of sleeplessness, extreme isolation, and the unyielding cold of the glacier had done something far worse. Something ancient was buried beneath the ice. Something that had been disturbed by their presence, by their unrelenting wakefulness. Something that was confined to penetrating the dreams of the occasional human presence in this remote wilderness, but was denied the chance to do so with this group. The serum had cracked open a door in their minds, allowing this presence to slip through. It had been waiting, dormant for centuries. Now it was awake, feeding off their fear, their madness, and their growing isolation. She spread the papers across her desk, her breath visible in the frigid air as she muttered to herself. "It's not an hallucination," she whispered. "We're seeing it because it's real." Dr. Lindstrom pieced together the fragmented transmissions from the outside world, the garbled warnings they'd received on day 30. The project's overseers had known something was wrong, but by then it was too late. The serum had opened them up to whatever lay beneath the glacier, an ancient malevolence that thrived on the very conditions that they'd engineered. The cold, the isolation, the endless wakefulness. She gathered the remaining survivors in the common area, her eyes wild with the weight of her discovery. "We're not imagining it," she said, her voice trembling. "This thing, whatever it is, it's real. It's been here for millennia, buried in the ice, and we've woken it up. The serum, it's made us vulnerable. We've opened our minds to it, and it's hunting us." Captain Rask and Dr. Eck exchanged uneasy glances, the horror of her words sinking in. They'd all seen the figures. They'd all felt the presence. None of them could deny the truth any longer. This wasn't just madness brought on by isolation. They were being hunted by something ancient, something that thrived on their terror. But the realization came too late. The group splintered almost immediately after Dr. Lindstrom's revelation. Fear and paranoia gripped them in its icy claws, turning their already frayed nerves into jagged shards of madness. The journalist, Johan Janssen, retreated to one of the bunker's storage rooms, barricading himself inside with what little rations he could carry. His paranoia had now evolved into full-blown delusion. "You can't trust them," he screamed through the door when Rask tried to coax him out. "They're already gone. They've let it in." He believed the others had been taken over by the ancient presence beneath the ice, convinced that the figures he saw lurking in the shadows had already claimed his fellow survivors. His voice grew quieter with each passing day, his muffled rants growing less coherent as he slipped further into madness. Captain Rask, on the other hand, held on to a desperate hope of escape. He began planning, scavenging supplies and mapping out possible routes to the surface, though the reality of the situation made it clear that any such attempt was suicidal. The entrances had been sealed, the communication systems had gone dead, and the extreme cold outside would kill them long before they reached civilization. But Rask clung to the plan, driven more by fear than logic. He knew staying in the bunker meant certain death, or worse. Dr. Eck, the biologist, took a different path. She became fixated on the idea of communicating with the presence in the glacier. It called to her in her dreams, even though none of them were supposed to be dreaming anymore. She believed that if she could understand it, she might be able to control it, to bargain with it somehow. She spent hours staring into the frost-covered walls, listening to the whispers, trying to decipher their meaning. She scrawled strange symbols in the frost, repeating phrases she'd heard in the murmurs, her mind slipping further and further into obsession. Dr. Lindstrom, the only one still grasping at sanity, watched in horror as the others descended into chaos. Time had lost all meaning. The days blurred together, and without clocks, they could no longer tell how long they'd been trapped. Weeks felt like months, or maybe it had only been hours. The cold seemed to stretch time itself, warping their perception of reality. The lights flickered constantly now, plunging them into moments of utter darkness, where the figures in the shadows seemed to creep closer, their twisted grins becoming more and more pronounced. The equipment malfunctioned at random, the air growing thinner as the life support system struggled to keep pace. Frost rimmed every surface, and the cold had become unbearable. Even the synthetic food rations had begun to freeze. One night, while Captain Rask was plotting his escape, the power failed completely. The bunker was plunged into darkness. For what felt like hours, the survivors sat in the black void, listening to the whispers, feeling the cold seep into their bones. And then, a scream pierced the silence. It was Dr. Eck. They found her in one of the deeper corridors, staring into the darkness, her hands pressed against the icy wall. Her body was rigid, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I've seen it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's beneath us, watching, waking. I spoke to it." Rask grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "What are you talking about? What did you see?" But she was too far gone. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her mind shattered. "We're already dead," she muttered. It's already claimed us." Rask stumbled back, his face pale. Dr. Lindstrom could feel the walls closing in. The presence was no longer just in the shadows, it was everywhere, filling the air, the walls, the very ice beneath their feet. The whispers grew louder and more insistent. Part 3. Day 50. By day 50, if it even was day 50, all hope had died. The bunker's walls felt like they were closing in. The air was thick with the oppressive cold and the ever-present whispers. The remaining survivors had splintered into shadows of themselves, paranoia and dread eating away at their sanity. Johan Janssen, now fully delirious, refused to leave his room. Dr. Eck wandered the walls, muttering to the unseen presence in the ice. Captain Rask, the last of the group with any semblance of reason, had finally reached his breaking point. The realization that they were completely trapped, with no way out and no one coming to save them, had eroded the last vestiges of his restraint. Rask's plan to escape had been futile from the start. He knew it, but the desire to fight, to take control of their fate, had been the only thing keeping him alive. So when the whispers grew louder, the figures in the shadows more brazen, he made a desperate decision. "We have to shut it all down," Rask muttered to Dr. Lindstrom, his breath visible in the freezing air. "If we kill the power, we can break whatever's happening. Maybe the doors will unseal. Maybe we can get out." Dr. Lindstrom stared at him, her eyes sunken and hollow. "We don't even know if that'll work. We could freeze to death in minutes without power. The system's the only thing keeping us alive." "Alive?" Rask scoffed bitterly. "Look around you, Lindstrom. We're already dead. The only question is how we die. Well, I'd rather take my chances." Lindstrom hesitated. She'd seen the things lurking just out of sight, felt the unnatural cold creeping into her bones. She knew Rask was right. This wasn't life, not anymore. The serum had done more than rob them of sleep. It had opened their minds to something far worse. And now whatever was buried beneath the glacier was clawing its way into their reality, feeding off their fear, their despair. "Fine," she said at last, her voice hoarse. "Do it." Rask didn't wait. He made his way to the power grid, the bunker's ancient, humming heart. The walls were slick with frost, the lights flickering ominously overhead. As he approached the controls, the whispers surged, louder and more chaotic than ever. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand. Possibly alien in origin, he thought. But the meaning was clear. "Do not resist." His hands trembled as he reached for the controls. The bunker had been designed with multiple failsafes, but Rask bypassed them all. He yanked the main power lever down, and the entire system screeched as the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. Darkness swallowed the bunker whole. The moment the power died, the temperature plummeted. The survivors could feel it immediately. The cold gnawing at their exposed skin, creeping up their limbs like icy fingers. Frost bloomed across the walls and floors, moving impossibly fast, as if the glacier itself were invading the bunker. Rask could barely see his hand in front of his face, but he could hear them, the whispers. They were everywhere now, surrounding him, filling the air with a low, mocking chant. And then in the pitch-black tunnel, he saw them. The figures. No longer hiding in the corners of his vision, no longer just shadows. They were real. Grotesque and half-formed, they crawled out of the dark. Twisted limbs, contorted faces with frozen maniacal grins. Some of them had eyes wide with terror, their skin blackened with frostbite, their bodies misshapen and unnatural. They were the stuff of nightmares, reflections of the darkest corners of Rask's mind, his deepest fears, his worst regrets. And they were coming for him. Rask stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. "Lindstrom," he called, though his voice was swallowed by the cold and the whispers. "Lindstrom." But Lindstrom had her own nightmare to face. Alone in the common area, the dark pressing in on all sides, she saw the creatures too, horrors dredged up from the depths of her guilt. They were utterly inhuman, surely creatures not from this earth. but in her deranged state they appeared as people she'd failed, experiments gone wrong, lives lost because of her hubris. They reached for her with skeletal hands, their eyes pleading, accusing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The bunker had become a labyrinth of terror, the walls twisting in ways that made no sense, the darkness consuming everything. Somewhere deeper in the facility, Dr. Eck was laughing. Not the laugh of a person who'd found humor in the situation, but the hysterical, broken laugh of someone who'd fully given in to madness. She wandered through the frozen halls, speaking to the unseen force in the ice as though it were an old friend. "I've seen it," she screamed into the void. "I've spoken to it." The thing in the ice had promised her something, though she no longer understood what. It whispered to her in a language older than time, promising freedom or perhaps oblivion. She followed its call blindly, her mind shattered. Rask, still in the tunnel, felt the cold crawling up his legs. He could barely move now, his body numb from the freezing temperature. The figures were closer, their grins impossibly wide, their hands outstretched. He could hear the others, Johann screaming in the storage room, Lindstrom pleading for forgiveness. But it was all drowned out by the whispers. In the end, it wasn't the cold that killed him. It was the creatures. They descended upon him with a fury he couldn't comprehend, their frozen hands pulling at him, tearing him apart piece by piece. His final moments were a blur of agony and terror as the last of his sanity slipped away. In the common area, Lindstrom could hear the same thing happening, the screams, the violence, but her mind was far too gone to process it. She collapsed to her knees, the frost creeping up her limbs, her eyes wide and unseeing. She could hear the whispers too, louder than ever now, filling her head until there was no room left for anything else. And then the darkness took her. Dr. Eck was the last one standing, although her mind was now fully consumed by the force she believed she communed with. She stood before the ice wall, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The whispers were no longer external. They were inside her now, guiding her, pulling her deeper into the madness. She reached out and touched the ice. In an instant, the whispers stopped. The temperature in the bunker dropped to a deadly low, the frost overtaking everything, sealing the facility in a tomb of ice. Weeks after the last transmission from Project Northern Watch, a retrieval team arrived at the forgotten Arctic facility. The air was brutally cold, even for the inhospitable Arctic Circle, and the howling wind only amplified the sense of dread that had settled over the region. As the team descended into the underground bunker, the thick layer of frost covering the entrance was a first ominous sign. No one expected the bunker to be in pristine condition, but the unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from the facility was unlike anything they'd anticipated. Their flashlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating twisted hallways now entirely frozen over. The walls, once smooth metal, were covered in a thick layer of ice, shimmering with frost. Everywhere they turned, strange symbols and cryptic messages were scrawled in what appeared to be a mix of blood and frost, an eerie testament to the madness that had consumed the volunteers. Their words were etched haphazardly in jagged lines, sentences that made no sense. It watches from the ice. The glacier whispers, and we are not alone. These markings covered every surface, including the floors and ceilings, as if the very walls of the bunker had been turned into a canvas for the last deranged thoughts of the participants. The retrieval team moved cautiously through the halls, their breath visible in the frigid air, their radios crackling with static. As they ventured deeper, the temperature dropped even further, well below what their equipment had been designed to handle. The bunker's heating system was completely offline, as if it had been deliberately shut down for some strange reason, and every step they took sent shudders of cold through their suits. Despite the heavy gear they wore, they felt as though the chill was seeping into their very bones. Inside the living quarters, they found the bodies of the volunteers, frozen solid in grotesque positions. One scientist sat hunched over a table, his hand outstretched toward a note that had long since been covered in frost. His eyes were open, wide with terror, as if he'd died mid-scream. Another lay curled up in a corner, her face contorted into a frozen grimace. One of the soldiers, Captain Rusk, was sprawled in the middle of a corridor, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his hands clawed and rigid with frostbite. His expression, too, was one of pure horror, a final frozen scream etched in his features. There was no sign of a struggle, at least not a conventional one. The retrieval team's sensors picked up no indication of an external threat. No breaches, no physical attacks. It was as though the group had simply succumbed to the cold and madness. But the bodies were the least unsettling aspect of what they found. Faint whispers echoed through the frozen halls, soft but insistent, as if the glacier itself was alive. At first, the team thought it was the wind howling through the cracks in the facility structure, but the sound seemed to follow them, growing louder the deeper they ventured. Some of the team members swore they could hear strange, inhuman voices, distorted, indecipherable murmurs that sent shivers down their spines. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere, and no amount of rational explanation could dispel the deep-rooted fear that they induced. As the team pushed further into the facility, they located the control room, where all attempts to contact the outside world had ceased. Here, the writing on the walls became more frenzied, the symbols more disturbing. Some of the messages were written in languages the retrieval team couldn't identify, while some were in cryptic mathematical formulas that defied logic. The walls bore deep scratches, as if someone or something had tried to crawl their way out. The center console was shattered, frozen solid as though it had been abandoned mid-use. There was no sign of Dr. Eck, the last scientist to be accounted for, nor of Johan Janssen, the journalist. Their rooms were empty, save for the same chaotic scribblings and frozen remnants of their belongings. It was as if they'd vanished, swallowed by the glacier itself. With no survivors, the team gathered what little data remained, but they knew there was no salvaging the truth of what had happened here. The official cause of death was quickly written off as psychological collapse due to extreme conditions. The sleep deprivation serum, they concluded, had driven the volunteers to insanity, causing them to turn on one another and ultimately succumb to the severe cold of the Arctic. But this explanation was only for the official report. Behind closed doors, the classified findings painted a much darker picture. The serum had certainly played a role, but the inexplicable events, the whispers, the frost, the cryptic messages, were all too disturbing to ignore. Some whispered of ancient, alien, malevolent forces buried deep in the ice, forces that had been disturbed by the experiment, forces that preyed on the weakened minds of the participants. The bunker, sealed from the outside world, had become a tomb for those who dared to unlock the secrets of the glacier. The retrieval team, who were extremely unnerved and unshaken by what they had witnessed, completed their mission and left the facility to its frozen grave. The authorities made the decision to abandon the site entirely. Project Northern Watch was quietly buried in its classified archives, its existence known only to a handful of individuals. The bunker, now entombed beneath layers of ice and snow, was left to be consumed by the Arctic's relentless cold. As the retrieval team gathered the last of their equipment, eager to leave the nightmare behind, a sudden burst of static crackled over the comms. The team froze in place, exchanging nervous glances. They had just shut down the remaining systems in the bunker. There was no reason for any signal to come through. Yet the static persisted, crackling louder before fading into a series of faint, scrambled words. At first, it was incomprehensible, a garbled mess of distorted sounds. But then, through the hiss and hum of interference, a voice emerged, weak, distorted, but unmistakably human. "It keeps us awake." The voice sent a chill throughout the room, even colder than the icy air. It was the voice of Johan Janssen, the journalist who'd disappeared, believed to be either dead or lost in the madness that had overtaken the others. His voice sounded distant, as though it was coming from deep within the glacier itself. The team members stared at one another, wide-eyed with disbelief. They'd found no trace of Janssen's body. He'd vanished without a sign. The transmission crackled again, stronger this time. The words were clearer, as if he were standing right behind them, yet warped and distant at the same time. The glacier keeps us awake. It keeps us forever. Then the radio went silent. The team leader frantically checked the equipment, looking for the source of the transmission. But nothing made sense. The bunker was dead, its systems cold and shut down. Janssen had been gone for weeks, his fate sealed beneath the ice. And yet his voice had come through as if he were still there, still alive, or something worse. Panic rippled through the team. They scrambled to leave the facility, their breaths quickening in the frigid air. There was no time to investigate the transmission or question what they'd heard. They had to get out, before they too became trapped beneath the ice, forever frozen with the horrors that lurked in the dark. As they ascended to the surface, the transmission echoed in their minds, leaving them with an unsettling truth they could never shake. What if he was still down there? What if the others were too? Weeks after the retrieval team returned to civilization, the site was officially declared off-limits by Scandinavian authorities. It was erased from maps, sealed off by a perimeter of unmanned guard posts, and shrouded in silence. No one was to speak of Project Northern Watch again. But despite the lockdown, rumors began to spread among the local Sami people and Arctic researchers. Strange lights had been spotted near the frozen wasteland where the facility lay buried. Aurora-like streaks of color flared across the horizon, flickering unnaturally fast, as if beckoning to something deep below. Explorers claimed to have heard voices on the wind, faint, ghostly murmurs that seemed to come from the glacier itself. Then came the sightings. Faint outlines beneath the ice, human-shaped figures frozen in perfect stillness, their forms twisted, contorted. Their faces, well, what little could be seen through the thick ice, or expressions of grotesque frozen grins. Some swore they could see the figure's eyes moving beneath the ice, as if they were still conscious, still watching, still awake. Reports of these sightings were dismissed by authorities as fanciful tales of optical illusions caused by the harsh Arctic conditions. But those who lived near the Arctic Circle knew better. The whispers persisted, carried on the wind, growing louder the closer one ventured to the old bunker site. The retrieval team, meanwhile, tried to forget what they'd experienced. Most of them retired from their posts, plagued by nightmares of the frozen figures, of walls covered in cryptic messages, and of that final transmission, the voice that had spoken from beyond the grave, warning them of the unearthly force that had claimed the minds and bodies of those in the bunker. But the nightmares never truly left them. And every so often, late at night, when the world was quiet and the Arctic wind howled through the darkness, they would hear it again, Janssen's voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the depths of the glacier. The glacier keeps us awake. It keeps us forever. And deep beneath the ice, the figures remained frozen, locked in eternal stasis, their faces twisted in unnatural grins, waiting. Epilogue. The present day. The helicopter's blades whirred, slicing through the cold Arctic air as it descended toward the glacier. Beneath them, a barren white landscape stretched as far as the eye could see, interrupted only by jagged ridges of ice and the faint outline of the long-abandoned facility. The mission was classified at the highest levels, so secret in fact that most of the team knew little beyond their immediate orders, recon and retrieval. Only one man, their commanding officer, had any real understanding of the true nature of their objective. Colonel Anderson gazed out at the frost-covered window, watching as the endless expanse of white drew nearer. He'd read the old declassified reports, what little information had survived from the 1962 experiment. What had happened here over half a century ago had been buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and misinformation, sealed away as nothing more than a tragic Cold War experiment gone wrong. But that was a lie. A dangerous, deliberate lie. Once the helicopter touched down, the team disembarked, their faces obscured by heavy weatherproof gear. The cold hit them like a physical force, though each of them had been trained to endure far worse conditions. They moved quickly, establishing a perimeter and securing the old entrance to the facility, now half buried under snow and ice. Colonel Anderson gathered the team inside, their boots crunching against the frost-covered floor of what had once been a hidden research bunker. The air inside was stale, filled with the echo of long-forgotten horrors. They knew this place had been a grave for those before them, but none of them truly understood the depth of what they were walking into. As they set up temporary lighting, Anderson called his unit to attention. His voice was calm, measured, but there was a weight to it that suggested far more than the usual military briefing. "Listen carefully," he began, his gaze scanning each of the faces before him. "You've all been briefed on this mission. Retrieve what we can, assess the situation, and, if necessary, neutralize any threats. But there's more. Much more. What happened here in 1962 wasn't a simple experiment in isolation. It wasn't just humans breaking under pressure. It was something else entirely." The team exchanged wary glances. Sergeant Lindstrom, one of the unit's top specialists, spoke up. "What are we dealing with, sir?" Anderson hesitated for a moment, weighing his words. "What you've been told, and what I know, only scratches the surface. In 1962, they were experimenting with a serum designed to eliminate sleep. But what they didn't know was that their isolation and that serum awoke something buried beneath the ice. Something not of this world." He let that sink in. The room was silent save for the hum of their equipment. "It wasn't the glacier," Anderson continued, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "It was something much older. An alien life form, frozen here for millennia, long before humans ever set foot in this region. And it didn't wake up because of the cold. It woke up because of us. Human consciousness specifically. It feeds on it, manipulates it. The presence the volunteers reported, it was real. It started with their minds, but it wants more than just control. It wants to use us." The revelation hung in the air like the frost that clung to the walls. "Why weren't we told this before?" asked Private Erickson, his voice tense. "Because even our governments don't fully understand what they're dealing with," Anderson replied. "But here's the truth. That life form is still here, frozen beneath the glacier, and it's still active, waiting for the right conditions to wake fully. We've been sent to determine whether there's any technological knowledge we can extract, but if it becomes hostile, we're authorized to destroy it. Completely." The gravity of their mission began to sink in, and Anderson could see the unease creeping into their eyes. But there was no time for doubt. They had to move forward. "Suit up. We're heading deeper into the facility." The team obeyed, preparing their gear and activating the mapping equipment that would guide them through the decaying tunnels. As they ventured further into the cold, forgotten corridors, the oppressive silence began to weigh on them, and the sense of being watched returned, just like it had for those here in 1962. Suddenly the comms crackled. A faint voice, distorted, was filtering through the static. It was impossible, but Anderson knew exactly what he was hearing. "It keeps us awake. It keeps us forever." The voice echoed through the corridor, unmistakable yet distant. The same eerie transmission from the long-dead journalist Johan Janssen. The team froze in place. Sergeant Lindstrom raised his hand to his earpiece, eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, is that—" Before he could finish, the ground beneath them trembled. The ice groaned, a low rumble that shook the walls. Lights flickered, plunging the team into intermittent darkness. The air grew colder, unnaturally cold even for this desolate place. "Stay together," Anderson barked, but as the tremor subsided, a new sound filled the void. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on ice. It came from the depths of the glacier, growing louder. In the far distance, through the flickering light, something moved. A shape, shadowed and indistinct, but unmistakably humanoid. He stood motionless for a heartbeat before disappearing into the shadows. "They're awake," Anderson whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "They've been waiting." The team raised their weapons, eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Somewhere beneath them, something ancient and malevolent had stirred. They were no longer alone, and whatever was down here wasn't just an alien presence, something far more dangerous. "Right, mission parameters have changed," Anderson said, his voice tight with tension. "Stay sharp. We're not leaving until we end this, one way or another." And as they pressed forward into the unknown, the whispers grew louder. Far beneath the ice, the alien intelligence stirred once more, ready to awaken fully. The soldiers' footsteps echoed through the frozen corridors, unknowingly heralding the start of something far worse than any of them had ever imagined. To be continued. Well, that was a bit insane, wasn't it? What a roller coaster ride that was. I couldn't really work out what was going on. Were there ghosts of something from the past? What was it? There were little hints that it might be something not of this world throughout, but okay, that's set up for what I really hope will be a sequel to this wonderful story. Okay, there's just too much going on for it to end like that. Please, author, please, keep going. Need more of it. Okay, tell me what you thought about that one. Thoughts, feelings, anything else you want to add to the conversation below the video, and as always, I will try to do my best to join in. Well, that is enough for what day it is. I've lost count what day it is. Wednesday, isn't it? Okay, podcast tomorrow night, and then back here on Friday with another. I've got a really, really good, well-written story for you on Friday night. About an hour and a half long, so I think you're going to really enjoy that one as well. Till the next time, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.